Hey guys, before we start tonight's journey back through time, get yourself comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already, sink into your pillow, maybe pull the blanket up just a little higher. If you're new here, consider sticking around and letting us know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's always nice to know who's drifting off with us. Now, settle in, and let's go back 3,000 years into the hush of the Egyptian desert, where a young man is about to spend his first night guarding the dead. The sun has only just gone down over the Valley of the Kings, and already the heat is draining out of the rock like water through cupped hands. Kenaman sits with his back against a low stone wall, still warm from the day, and watches the last orange light climb the cliffs above him. He is 19. He has never done this before. His spear rests across his knees, its shaft worn smooth by other hands, other knights. Someone else held this same weapon last year, and the year before that, and further back than anyone bothers to count. The thought settles over him slowly, the way the cold will soon settle over the valley. He is not the first, and he will not be the last. Around him, the other guards move without hurry. An older man named Pharaoh checks the knots on a rope ladder, testing each one with a tug, though he has surely tugged the same knots 1,000 times before. A brazier is lit near the tomb entrance, more for the guards' comfort than for light. The tomb itself needs no illumination tonight. It has been sealed for months. Kenaman watches the smoke rise straight up into the still air, unbending, unbothered by wind. Out here, even the smoke seems to know how to behave. First watch is the easy one, Pharaoh says without looking up from his knots. The desert's still warm. Wait until the third watch. That's when you'll understand why we wear wool in a place that burns you alive by noon. Kenaman nods, though he isn't sure what there is to understand yet. He only knows what he was told when he was chosen for this posting 3 weeks ago. That the tombs of the pharaohs are not guarded by soldiers alone, but by men who can be trusted to stay awake, stay quiet, and stay still. Stillness, it turns out, is a skill nobody teaches you until you need it. The valley itself seems built for that kind of quiet. Steep walls of pale limestone rise on either side, catching the last color of the sky and holding it a moment longer than the ground below. No trees grow here, no birds call. The only sound is the occasional shift of sand, a small, dry whisper, as if the desert is turning over in its sleep. Somewhere behind that sealed doorway, deep in the rock, lies a pharaoh whose name Kenaman was told just once and has already half forgotten. It doesn't matter, he realizes. His job isn't to remember the man. His job is to remember the door. As true dark settles in, the temperature begins its long fall. The sand that scorched his sandals at midday now feels almost cool beneath him. Pharaoh was right about one thing already. This early hour is the easy part. Kenaman pulls his cloak tighter and glances toward the cliff line, where the first stars are beginning to prick through a sky gone the color of a bruise, deep blue fading into black. A junior guard named Sati approaches with a small clay jar of water and passes it along without a word. It's their way out here. Conversation rationed like the water, spent only when it's worth spending. Kenaman drinks, hands the jar back, and returns his eyes to the tomb entrance. There isn't much to see. A blank wall of packed rubble and plaster, marked with seals that catch the last light of the fire. But it is precisely because there is nothing to see that the watching matters. Nothing must change. No mark disturbed, no seal broken, no shadow where a shadow shouldn't fall. His entire task, for the next several hours, is to notice absence. To know so completely what should be there that anything wrong announces itself instantly. Pharaoh settles down beside him at last, his knots finished, his rounds complete for now. He doesn't offer advice this time. He simply sits, The way a man sits who has done this so many nights that his body has stopped needing instruction. Kenneman finds himself matching his breathing to the older man's, slow and even, and for the first time since the sun went down, the tightness in his chest begins to loosen. The fire crackles low. The valley holds its long, patient silence. Whatever waits behind that sealed door has waited for months already, and will go on waiting long after Kenneman's watch tonight has ended. Above them, more stars arrive, scattered without pattern across the deepening sky, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a fox calls once and falls silent. The night has only just begun. The fire has burned down to embers by the time Kenneman's mind wanders back to the walk that brought him here. The long approach into the valley itself, made only once, 3 weeks ago, but still vivid enough to replace the silence with memory. He remembers arriving in daylight, which he now understands was a kindness. Nobody sends a new guard into the Valley of the Kings for the first time after dark. Better to let the place introduce itself slowly, in full sun, when its strangeness can be softened by ordinary light. The path in was narrow, cut between walls of rock so steep they seemed to lean inward, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. There was no gentle slope down into it, no gradual reveal. One moment he was climbing a dusty track through scrubland, and the next, the land simply opened, and he was standing inside a stone amphitheater built by nothing but wind and time. His guide that day, a scribe's assistant named Amenhotep, walked a half step ahead and said little. Kenneman remembers asking, foolishly, how many tombs were cut into these cliffs. Amenhotep had only shrugged. More than are known, he said. Fewer than our guessed. That answer has stayed with Kenneman longer than he expected it to. The tombs themselves, when he finally saw their entrances, were almost disappointingly plain. No towering statues, no painted facades facing outward for the world to admire. Just narrow doorways cut low into the rock. Some already sealed with rubble and plaster, others still open, their interiors dark as closed eyes, waiting for workmen still finishing the final chambers within. It struck him then, and strikes him again now, staring at the ash, grey remains of tonight's fire, how deliberately hidden it all was. Every choice made by the builders seemed designed to erase itself. Entrances tucked into folds of the cliff face, debris scattered to disguise, fresh digging. False passages carved to mislead anyone who managed to break through the first seal. The grandeur of a king's death, buried not to be seen, but to be forgotten by everyone except the handful of men sworn to remember it. Amenhotep had led him past 3 sealed doorways before stopping at a 4th. Larger than the others, its threshold swept clean that very morning. This one, he'd said. This is the one you'll come to know. Kenneman had studied the seal pressed into the plaster. A small oval stamp, the mark of the royal necropolis, pressed there by officials whose names he would never learn. It looked, he thought at the time, almost fragile. A thin skin of clay standing between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond it. He asked Amenhotep what would happen if the seal were ever broken by someone other than the priests who were meant to open it in some distant future. The older man had stopped walking for a moment, considering the question with more weight than Kenneman expected. Then a great many people would have failed at their only task. Amenhotep said finally. Me. Everyone whose name is written on the roster for this posting. That failure would follow us long after we're gone. He resumed walking without further explanation, and Kenneman had understood, even then, that this was not a threat, but simply a fact. The kind of fact men here carried quietly, the way they carried water and rope, and the small clay lamps that lit their inspections. Now, sitting in the cooling dark of his first real watch, Kenneman turns that memory over once more, feeling its weight settle differently than it did 3 weeks ago. Back then, the tomb was an idea, a task described to him in a courtyard far from here. Tonight, it is 11 paces away, sealed and silent, close enough that he could reach out and press his palm against the same plaster Amenhotep once pointed to. He doesn't. He simply watches it, the way he's been trained to, and lets the memory of that first walk settle into something more useful than nostalgia, a kind of understanding. This place was built to be approached carefully by the few who were trusted to approach it at all. And now, for reasons he still doesn't fully feel worthy of, he is one of them. Beside him, Pharaoh shifts slightly in his sleep, one hand still loosely curled around the shaft of his spear even in rest. Kenneman envies that ease, and wonders how many more nights it will take before his own body learns to trust this place enough to relax within it. Above the tomb's threshold, the seal catches a last flicker of dying firelight, and holds it there, unmoving, exactly as it should. Dawn is still hours away, but Kenneman's thoughts have drifted from memory into something closer to wondering. How does a man come to be chosen for this, out of all the men in Egypt who might have wanted it, or feared it, in equal measure? He knows his own path only in fragments. His father worked stone in the quarries near Aswan, and it was there, hauling blocks under a foreman's watchful eye, that Kenneman first learned the particular discipline of doing difficult things without complaint. That discipline, it turned out, was noticed. A quarry overseer with connections to the necropolis administration had recommended him, along with 2 other young men, for a posting that was never fully explained until he arrived. It wasn't strength they wanted, though strength didn't hurt. It wasn't even bravery, not really, despite what the old stories liked to claim about the guardians of kings. What they wanted, Kenneman came to understand during his selection, was something harder to name. Reliability. The kind of man who would still be standing at his post at the end of a long, uneventful night, exactly as he'd been at the beginning of it. The selection process itself had surprised him with its quiet thoroughness. There were no tests of combat, no contests of speed or skill. Instead, there were interviews conducted by an official whose title Kenneman never learned, who asked strange, patient questions. Had he ever fallen asleep while meant to be working? Did he speak often, or only when necessary? Could he sit still for the length of an entire afternoon, doing nothing but watching a single point in the distance? He remembers answering honestly, mostly because he hadn't yet learned what answers were being sought. Only later did Pharaoh explain, during one of their earliest shared watches, that this was precisely the point. Men who tried too hard to seem perfect for the post were usually the ones who failed it fastest. The guards themselves come from every corner of the kingdom, not from any single trade or family line. There are former farmers among them, men who understand patience because crops demand it. There are sons of minor officials, comfortable with the necropolis's careful hierarchies and endless documentation. There is even, Pharaoh once mentioned, a former court musician, dismissed from his post for reasons never fully explained, who found in tomb guarding a stillness not unlike the pause between movements of a song. What unites them, Kenneman has come to believe, isn't background but temperament. A guard who guards the Pharaoh's rest must first master something quieter within himself, an ability to remain present without needing anything to happen. Most men, he suspects, would find this unbearable within a single night. He is only beginning to learn whether he is one of the few who won't. Payment for the post is modest but steady, distributed in grain and cloth through the necropolis administration, along with certain privileges unavailable to ordinary laborers. Access to better wells, occasional festival rations, a status quietly respected in the workers' village nearby, even if never spoken of loudly. But money, Kenneman suspects, was never the true incentive for most of the men who take up this work. There is something else here, harder to name, that draws them. Perhaps it is proximity to something larger than an ordinary life. To stand this close to a king, even one long dead, even one whose face none of them will ever see, changes how a man understands his own smallness. Kenneman isn't certain yet whether that feeling is a comfort or a burden. Perhaps, he thinks, it will turn out to be both, depending on the night. Pharaoh stirs again beside him, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back into sleep. Kenneman studies his weathered profile in the faint orange glow of the last embers and wonders what questions were asked of him decades ago, when he too was young and untested and standing at the edge of this same valley for the first time. Whatever those questions were, Pharaoh answered them well enough to still be here now, still trusted, still chosen, night after uncounted night. Kenneman hopes, quietly, that the same will one day be said of him. Far above, the stars continue their slow crossing of the sky, indifferent to the small human question of who is worthy to stand watch beneath them. The night deepens, and somewhere behind the ridge, faint and far, comes the sound of a dog barking twice before falling silent. It is a small thing, barely worth noticing, but it pulls Kenneman's mind away from the tomb itself and toward the small, sprawling world that exists just beyond this valley's stone walls. The village where the guards, and the workers who cut these tombs, actually live. They call it simply the place of truth, though Kenneman has never asked why. It sits in a shallow basin not far from the Valley of the Kings. Close enough to walk in under an hour, far enough that its lamplight never reaches the tombs themselves. He has only been there a handful of times since his posting began, but already its rhythms feel more familiar to him than the silence of the valley does. Unlike the tombs, the village is loud with the business of the living. Mud brick houses stand close together along narrow lanes, their walls washed white, their doorways hung with woven mats to keep out flies and dust in equal measure. Smoke rises from cooking fires at dusk, thick with the smell of grilled fish and baked bread, and children run between the houses long after they should be asleep, chased half-heartedly by mothers too tired from the day's work to chase very hard. The men who live here are not soldiers, not truly, whatever their duties in the valley might suggest. By day, many of them work stone, plaster walls, grind pigments for the painters who decorate the tomb's inner chambers. Guarding is often a role taken in rotation, one duty among several, shared out across a community that understands, better than almost anyone else in Egypt, exactly what lies sealed within these cliffs. Kenneman remembers his first evening there, sitting outside a doorway with Pharaoh's family while a meal of lentils and onions was passed between them. Pharaoh's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Nifret, had studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You have the quiet look," she said. "Good. The valley eats the ones who don't." He hadn't known, at the time, whether to take this as comfort or warning. He still doesn't, entirely. What struck him most, though, was how ordinary it all felt, despite the extraordinary work these families were bound to. Here, a woman haggled cheerfully over a basket of dates. There, two boys argued about whose turn it was to fetch water from the well nearest the village edge. A donkey brayed somewhere, indignant about some perceived injustice, and was ignored by everyone within earshot. It was easy, sitting among them, to forget that just beyond the ridge lay a valley devoted entirely to death, and to men whose duty was to guard it through the night. The village seemed to exist as a kind of counterweight. Kenneman thinks now, staring at the dim shape of the sealed tomb before him. For every hour spent in the valley's careful silence, there is a corresponding hour, somewhere close by, filled with laughter and argument and the small, stubborn noise of people simply living. He wonders, sometimes, whether the workers grow used to the strangeness of their double life, moving daily between a place built entirely around the dead and a place bursting, however humbly, with the living. Pharaoh, when asked once, had only shrugged in that way of his, as if the question itself missed something obvious. "A man needs both," he'd said. "Too much of the valley, and you forget what you're guarding it for. Kenneman turns that answer over now, watching the last coal in the fire pit shift and settle into ash. Too much of the valley, and you forget what you're guarding it for. He isn't certain, 3 weeks into this work, that he yet understands what that means. But something in him suspects he will, eventually, the way Pharaoh clearly already does. A faint breeze moves down from the cliffs, carrying with it, just barely, the ghost of wood smoke from some fire in the village beyond the ridge. Kenneman breathes it in, grateful for the reminder that beyond this circle of stone and silence, ordinary life continues, stubborn and warm, exactly as it should. The valley holds still around him. Somewhere past the ridge, the dog barks once more, then falls quiet for good. A soft rustle nearby draws Kenneman's attention. Pharaoh stirring at last, sitting upright with the unhurried ease of a man whose body wakes on its own schedule, no matter the hour. He rubs one hand across his face, glances briefly at the sky to judge the time, then reaches for the near-empty water jar without a word. "You're still awake," Pharaoh says, not quite a question. "I've been thinking." Kenneman admits. "That's your first mistake." Pharaoh says it without unkindness. More habit than reprimand. Out here, thinking too much just keeps you company with things better left alone. Better to work. Work keeps a man's mind where it belongs. It's as good a cue as any, Kenneman realizes, to ask the question he's been holding since his first night. What, exactly, does a day in this posting actually look like, beyond the watching itself? Pharaoh considers this while he ties off the water jar's stopper. "Depends which watch you draw," he says. But there's always more to it than standing still and looking serious. He explains it the way he explains most things, without much ornament, laying out the shape of the work as plainly as a man might describe how to plaster a wall. Each guard's day begins, technically, before the sun does. A walk around the perimeter of the assigned tomb, checking the ground itself as much as the seal. Footprints where there shouldn't be any. Displaced stones. Anything that suggests the quiet of the previous night was disturbed by something other than wind. Then comes the inspection of the seal itself. Close and careful, fingers tracing the edges of the plaster without ever quite touching it, searching for hairline cracks too fine to see by torchlight, but easy enough to miss by careless daylight glancing. Kenneman had watched Pharaoh perform this ritual just yesterday morning, moving with the unhurried precision of a man checking on a sleeping child. Thorough, but gentle. Beyond the inspections, the guards maintain the practical machinery of their own watch. Ropes are checked for fraying, since some duties require guards to be lowered into shaft entrances still under construction nearby. Water jars are refilled from a well shared with the nearest work crew. Torches and lamps are trimmed and oiled, their wicks cut precisely enough to burn clean and slow through the long stretches of full darkness. There is also, Pharaoh mentions almost as an afterthought, the matter of record keeping. Not every guard can write, but every watch group includes at least one who can, and each morning a brief account is given to a scribe stationed nearer the village. Nothing eventful to report, most days, though Pharaoh says the words with a certain dry weight that suggests not every day has been so uneventful in his many years here. And when nothing happens, Kenneman asks, "Which is most nights, I'm told, most nights?" Pharaoh agrees. "But you don't guard a tomb the way you guard a granary. A thief comes for grain because he's hungry today. A man comes for a pharaoh's tomb because he's patient enough to wait for the one night nobody's watching closely. So we watch closely, every night, whether something happens or not." He glances sideways at Kenneman. That's the whole trick of it. Doing the same careful thing, every single time, as if it were the one time that mattered. Because eventually, it will be. It's a heavier thought than Kenneman expected this deep into the night, and he sits with it for a moment, watching the horizon for any hint of the dawn that still feels impossibly far off. There are lighter duties too, Pharaoh adds, sensing perhaps that the conversation has drifted somewhere too solemn for this hour. Guards rotate through simple maintenance around the valley, clearing loose rubble that shifts down from the cliffs after a rare rain, repainting faded boundary markers, escorting the occasional official who arrives to inspect the necropolis's condition. None of it glamorous. All of it, in its own quiet way, part of the same unbroken discipline that keeps the valley as still and undisturbed as it has been for generations. Kenneman listens, filing each detail away, understanding now that the stillness he witnessed on his first night wasn't emptiness at all. It was simply discipline, worn so smooth by repetition that it had come to look, from a distance, like nothing happening at all. Above them, the stars continue their hurried crossing, indifferent as ever to the small, careful rituals unfolding beneath them. The last trace of grey has finally drained from the sky by the time Seti returns from his rounds, his sandals whispering softly against packed sand as he circles back toward the fire. He crouches, warms his hands briefly though the night hasn't yet turned cold enough to need it, and gives a small nod to Pharaoh. "Nothing," he says, "same as it should be." It's a phrase Kenneman is beginning to understand carries more weight than its brevity suggests. "Nothing," said the right way, isn't an absence of information. It's a report in itself. With full dark now settled properly over the valley, Kenneman notices a shift in the guards around him, subtle but unmistakable, like a held breath finally released. The transition from dusk to true night seems to matter here in a way he hadn't expected. During the fading light, there had still been a kind of softness to things, shadows still negotiable, shapes still capable of resolving themselves into something ordinary if looked at twice. Now, with the sun fully gone, the valley commits to its darkness completely. Pharaoh rises and begins his own slow circuit, and this time Kenneman follows a pace behind, eager to learn the choreography of the walk itself. It isn't complicated, but it is precise. They move along the base of the cliff first, close enough to touch the stone, checking for anything that might catch shadow strangely against the pale rock. Then out toward the open center of the small side valley, where their tomb sits, turning in a slow half-circle to view the entrance from a distance, the way a stranger might see it, rather than the way familiarity has taught them to see it. You look at it twice, Pharaoh explains quietly as they walk. Once as yourself, once as someone who's never seen it before. The second look catches what the first one misses. Kenneman tries this now, forcing his tired eyes to see the tomb entrance freshly, as if for the first time. In the weak orange light still drifting from their distant fire, the sealed doorway looks almost sculptural, the seals themselves catching small glints of reflected light where the plaster has been smoothed to a faint sheen by careful hands. They pause at the halfway point of their circuit, where a natural outcropping of rock offers a slightly elevated view back toward the tomb. From here, the whole scene organizes itself differently. The fire a small dot of warmth in an otherwise cold landscape, the tomb entrance a dark seam in pale stone, the cliffs rising protectively, almost deliberately, around the entire scene like cupped hands. "This is my favorite point," Pharaoh admits, something almost boyish creeping into his usually flat voice. "Not because anything happens here. Because from here, you can see that nothing needs to." Kenneman understands, or begins to, standing beside him in the cold hush of full night. There is a kind of confidence in this vantage point, a reassurance built from repetition. Pharaoh has stood exactly here, on exactly this outcropping, more times than either of them could count, and each time, the tomb has remained exactly as it should. That accumulated evidence has become its own kind of comfort. They continue the circuit, moving now along the valley's far edge, where loose scree occasionally shifts beneath careless footing. Pharaoh moves with practiced lightness here, avoiding the loudest patches of gravel out of old habit rather than present necessity. Kenneman tries to match his path exactly, stepping where Pharaoh steps, and finds, to his quiet satisfaction, that he manages it without a single stumble. By the time they complete the loop and return to the fire, Sati has already settled back into a light doze, his spear propped carefully against a rock beside him, close enough to reach without looking. Pharaoh checks the fire once more, adds a small piece of dried brush to keep it low but steady, and resumes his seat with the same unhurried ease he seems to bring to everything. "Second watch is yours alone soon," he tells Kenneman, not unkindly, simply stating what the schedule requires. "I'll be nearby, but you'll walk it yourself." Kenneman nods, feeling something tighten briefly in his chest before easing again, the same way it did at the very start of the night. He glances once more toward the tomb entrance, dark and steady in the deepening cold, and finds that the sight no longer unsettles him quite as much as it did a few hours ago. The valley settles into its long middle stretch of night, patient and unbroken, waiting to see how the newest of its guardians will manage his first watch alone. True to Pharaoh's word, the moment arrives without announcement. He simply rises, stretches once, and gestures toward the outcropping they'd stood on earlier. "Your turn," he says. "I'll be at the fire. Call if you need to. Otherwise, just walk it." And then Kenneman is alone with the tomb for the first time. The silence that follows isn't the comfortable, shared silence of sitting beside Pharaoh. It's a fuller thing, pressing in from every direction at once, made larger by the sudden absence of another breathing body nearby. He becomes aware, in a way he wasn't moments ago, of just how completely sound behaves out here. There is no echo in the ordinary sense. The open sky swallows noise before it can bounce back to confirm it was ever made. A dropped pebble simply vanishes into silence, as if the desert itself absorbs evidence. He takes up the small clay lamp Pharaoh left him, its flame a modest, steady thing, cupped protectively within his palm as he begins his circuit. The light it throws is barely enough to see by, a small warm circle that moves with him, revealing perhaps 3 paces of ground before surrendering everything beyond to darkness. It occurs to him, as he walks, that this is by design as much as necessity. Torches burned too fiercely would ruin a guard's night vision entirely, leaving him blind to anything beyond the flame's reach. Better to see poorly but broadly than brilliantly but not at all. The tomb entrance, when he reaches it, looks different alone than it did with Pharaoh at his side. Not more threatening, exactly, but more present, as if its silence now requires his full attention rather than sharing it generously with someone else's awareness. He studies the seal the way he was taught, close but careful, letting the lamp's small light travel slowly across its surface, searching for anything that shouldn't be there. Nothing has changed. Of course, nothing has changed. And yet the checking itself feels different when there's no one beside him to share the responsibility of noticing. A sound reaches him then, faint and unfamiliar, and his whole body goes still before his mind even identifies it. A soft, dry rustle, somewhere off to his left, low against the ground. His hand tightens instinctively around his spear, though he doesn't yet raise it. He waits, listening, letting the seconds stretch. The sound comes again, and this time he places it. Some small creature, a desert mouse perhaps, or one of the pale geckos that live in the cracks of the cliff face, moving through loose gravel in search of whatever meager life survives out here. After dark, he exhales slowly, feeling faintly foolish, though Pharaoh, watching from the fire, would likely tell him there was nothing foolish in it at all. Better to startle at nothing 100 times than miss the one thing that matters. He continues his circuit, more aware now of how the desert's silence isn't truly silence at all, once a person learns to listen properly. Small sounds live within it constantly. The tick of cooling stone contracting after the day's heat, the whisper of sand shifting under its own slow weight. The occasional distant call of some night bird he can't identify, thin and lonely against the vast quiet. Above him, away from the small circle of his lamp, the sky has become almost unbearably full. Stars crowd every available space, undimmed by any light but their own and the faint ember glow of the distant fire. He pauses at the outcropping point Pharaoh showed him earlier, looking back at that fire now, small and steady, and feels, for the first time tonight, something like ease settling into his shoulders. The tomb remains sealed and silent behind him. The desert holds its usual conversation of small sounds around him, and Kenneman, standing alone beneath more stars than he has ever properly counted, understands that this, too, is part of what he was chosen for. Not the absence of fear, but the steadiness to stand quietly within it until it passes. He resumes his circuit, lamp cupped carefully in his palm, footsteps soft against ancient stone. By the time Kenneman completes his second full circuit, a heaviness has begun creeping into his limbs. The particular kind of tiredness that comes not from labor, but from sustained attention. He returns to the fire to find Pharaoh awake again, rebuilding the flame with a few careful sticks, and lowers himself onto the flat stone that has become, in just a few hours, something like a familiar seat. "You'll sleep in shifts," Pharaoh tells him before Kenneman can even ask. 2 hours, maybe 3, depending how the night's divided among however many of us are posted. Never more than that. A man who sleeps too deep out here wakes up slower than he should, and slow is the one thing this post can't forgive. Kenneman glances toward the small shelter he'd noticed on his first day, but hadn't yet used. A rough lean-to built from mud brick and palm thatch, tucked against the cliff base a short distance from the tomb itself, close enough to reach quickly, far enough not to loom over the sealed entrance like an intrusion. "That's where I'll sleep?" he asks. Pharaoh nods. "When it's your turn." Not much to it. Keeps the worst of the wind off, and the scorpions mostly know to avoid it, though mostly isn't always. He says this last part with the flat delivery of a man who has learned the hard way and is offering the lesson forward as a kindness, rather than a warning. Kenneman rises and crosses to the shelter to look properly for the first time. Inside, it is little more than a packed dirt floor and a woven mat, along with a folded blanket left by whoever slept there last. The walls are low, barely enough to sit upright beneath, built more for shade and windbreak than for any real comfort. Still, compared to sitting fully exposed beside the fire, it offers something like privacy, a small pocket of enclosed space in a landscape defined mostly by its openness. He runs a hand along the nearest wall, feeling the rough texture of sun-dried brick, still faintly warm from the day's heat despite the hours since sundown. Mudbrick holds warmth longer than the open sand does, he realizes, understanding for the first time why the shelter was built where it was, angled just so against the cliff to catch what lingering heat the stone still radiates through the coldest hours before dawn. Rotation goes youngest to oldest, mostly, Pharaoh explains when Kenneman returns to the fire. "Which means you'll get first turn at the shelter tonight, once your watch is done. Small mercy of being the newest among us." Kenneman isn't sure whether to feel grateful or uneasy at the idea of sleeping while the others remain awake and alert around him, responsible in part for his safety while his guard is down. Pharaoh seems to read this hesitation without needing it spoken aloud. "Don't waste time feeling guilty about rest," he says. "Rest is part of the work too. A guard who doesn't sleep properly becomes a guard who can't watch properly. We look out for each other in shifts because that's the only way any of this holds together night after night, year after year." It's a practical wisdom, Kenneman thinks, turning it over as he settles back onto his stone seat, one that extends beyond just this small circle of guards. The whole system, he's beginning to understand, depends on this kind of careful, distributed trust. men taking turns being vulnerable so that the tomb itself never is. Later, when his turn finally comes, Kenneman ducks into the low shelter and settles onto the woven mat, pulling the blanket over himself despite the day's heat still faintly lingering in the walls around him. Sleep doesn't come immediately. He lies still, listening to the muffled sounds of the fire crackling somewhere beyond the mud-brick walls, the occasional soft murmur of voices too low to make out clearly. It strikes him, in the drowsy space between waking and sleep, that this small shelter is perhaps the most ordinary thing in the entire valley. A simple room for simple rest, built by simple hands, no different in its essential purpose from any shelter anywhere in Egypt. And yet its placement, tucked so close against a sealed royal tomb, makes it feel like something else entirely. A small human comfort, deliberately kept close to something far larger than comfort was ever meant to touch. Sleep finds him eventually, thin and watchful, even in rest. The way sleep seems to work for everyone posted in this valley. Kenneman wakes before he means to, some innate sense pulling him from sleep well ahead of whoever was meant to rouse him. For a moment, disoriented, he isn't certain how long he's been under the blanket, whether minutes or hours have passed. Then he hears Pharaoh's low voice outside, casual and unhurried, and understands that his rest, however brief, has done what it needed to. He emerges from the shelter to find the fire, built up slightly higher than before, and Sati crouched beside it, turning something small and dark over the coals, a strip of dried fish, from the smell of it, being warmed rather than cooked. Sleep well? Pharaoh asks, not really expecting an answer. Kenneman stretches, feeling the stiffness of the packed dirt floor still lingering in his back, and settles once more onto his usual stone. It's here, in this quiet lull before his next circuit, that his mind drifts back towards something he hasn't yet properly considered. The punishing heat that governs every daylight hour in this valley, and the small, persistent creatures that seem to thrive despite it. He remembers his first full day here with a clarity that still faintly unsettles him. The sun in the Valley of the Kings doesn't simply warm the air, it seems to physically press down against every surface, turning pale limestone cliffs into something closer to a kiln by midday. Even now, hours into full darkness, he can recall the particular way the ground had burned faintly through his sandals that first afternoon, forcing him to keep moving rather than stand still in any one place too long. You get used to it, Sati offers, noticing perhaps the direction of Kenneman's thoughts. Not comfortable. Just used to it. There's a difference. The dust, Kenneman has learned, is its own separate trial entirely. Fine and pale, it finds its way into everything, woven into the fibers of clothing, no matter how carefully folded, gritty between teeth despite every precaution taken with food and water, settling in a thin film across skin that no amount of washing at day's end seems fully able to remove. Pharaoh once described it, with the particular dry humor Kenneman is slowly learning to recognize, as the valley's way of making certain no man forgets exactly where he's standing. And then there are the insects, smaller trials that accumulate into larger irritations across a long posting. Kenneman has already met several of the valley's more determined residents. Flies arrive with the first proper heat of morning, persistent and maddening around eyes and mouth, driven off temporarily only by smoke or constant motion. Scorpions, pale and nearly invisible against sun-bleached stone, favor the cool shadows beneath rocks, and guards learn quickly. The insides of unshaken sandals left overnight. Always shake your sandals. Pharaoh had told him on his very first morning, with the flat seriousness of a man repeating a lesson learned the hard way rather than a mere formality. Every single time. Doesn't matter how tired you are. Doesn't matter how certain you feel nothing's there. Shake them. Kenneman had followed that instruction faithfully ever since, and intends to continue doing so for as long as he holds this post. Beyond scorpions, There are the small biting insects that emerge with the cooling air of evening. Thin whining things that seem to favor ears and the soft skin behind the neck, driven off only by the smoke of a well-tended fire, or failing that, patient endurance. Kenneman has already developed the habit, without quite realizing it, of sitting slightly closer to the smoke than strictly necessary for warmth alone. What strikes him most, turning these thoughts over now in the relative cool of deep night, is how thoroughly this landscape demands constant, small adjustments from anyone who hopes to endure it for long. Nothing about the valley accommodates comfort easily. Every element of daily survival here, from shelter placement to sandal, shaking to the careful rationing of water, has clearly been shaped by generations of guards learning, likely through considerable discomfort, exactly what this place requires of those who serve within it. First season's the hardest, Pharaoh says, apparently following a similar thread of thought without needing to be told what Kenneman was considering. Body needs time to learn the rules here. After that, it's just habit. Uncomfortable habit, maybe, but habit all the same. Asati passes the warmed fish along the small circle, and Kenneman accepts his share gratefully. Grateful too for the reminder that even amid the valley's countless small hardships, small comforts persist alongside them, offered freely between men who understand, better than most, exactly how much such small kindnesses matter out here. The last piece of fish finished, Sati wipes his fingers absently against his kilt and glances toward the tomb entrance, his expression settling into something more thoughtful than his usual easy manner. Do you ever wonder? He asks nobody in particular. What's actually down there, beneath all that plaster and rubble? Pharaoh makes a small sound that might be amusement. Every guard wonders that. First year, mostly. Then you learn it doesn't matter what's down there. Only that it stays down there. But Kenneman finds himself wondering anyway, turning the question over as the fire settles lower between them. He has heard fragments, the way anyone posted here eventually does, whispered descriptions passed between workers who helped seal the final chambers, half-understood accounts of what lies beyond that plain rock doorway. Gold, certainly. Not coins, for Egypt has no such thing, but gold worked into shapes meant to accompany a king through whatever comes after this life. Vessels for oils and perfumes, their surfaces catching lamplight the way still water catches moonlight. Furniture, some of it, built specifically for the tomb, and never intended for use in the world of the living. Chairs no living body would ever sit in. Beds no living body would ever sleep upon. There are said to be chests of linen, folded and stored with the same care a mother might use for a child's first garments. Weapons, ceremonial rather than practical, their blades never meant to draw blood, only to accompany their owner in symbolic readiness. And somewhere at the heart of it all, sealed within chamber after chamber, the king himself, prepared with rituals Kenneman understands only in the vaguest outline, wrapped and protected for a journey no living guard will ever witness the start of. It isn't really about the gold, Pharaoh says eventually, breaking the silence that has settled over the three of them. Gold can be replaced. Melted down, reshaped, made into something new. What can't be replaced is what all of it represents. Everything down there was chosen, placed, arranged for a purpose that matters more than its price. Kenneman considers this, watching the tomb's dark silhouette against the star-scattered sky. He has always understood, in some abstract way, that his duty involves protecting wealth. But Pharaoh's framing suggests something else entirely. That the true treasure isn't the objects themselves, but the completeness of the arrangement they belong to. A single vessel, stolen, wouldn't simply be a loss of gold. It would be a wound in something larger, a careful design broken by absence, a king sent into eternity missing some small piece of what he was meant to carry with him. The priests spent moons preparing everything. Sati adds, his voice quieter now, some of his earlier lightness fading into genuine solemnity. Every object has its place, its purpose. Nothing down there is accidental. It strikes Kenneman, sitting with this thought in the cooling night air, that his role here is less like guarding a storehouse and more like guarding a sentence left unfinished. Each object a word that must remain exactly where it was placed for the whole to retain its meaning. Disturb even one small thing, and something essential breaks, even if the theft itself seems minor by any ordinary measure. Is that why the entrances are hidden? He asks. Not just to stop thieves, but because he struggles to finish the thought properly. Because some things aren't meant to be found by accident. Pharaoh finishes for him, only by those who understand what they're looking at, and why it matters. He pokes at the fire absently, sending a small shower of sparks briefly upward before they fade into darkness. Most men who'd break that seal wouldn't understand any of that. They'd see gold, just gold. That's exactly why we're here. The three of them fall quiet again, each settling back into private thought. The tomb's dark doorway holding its silence just paces away, patient and complete, exactly as the priests intended it to remain. Kenneman finds himself, for the first time since arriving in this valley, feeling less like a soldier posted to a duty and more like a small, willing part of something far larger than himself. A quiet participant in a design meant to outlast every guard who will ever stand watch over it. The mention of theft lingers between them longer than the fire's warmth does, and after a stretch of quiet, Seti speaks again, his voice pitched lower than before, almost reluctant here. In this valley, Pharaoh doesn't answer right away. He reaches for a piece of dried brush, feeds it slowly into the fire, and watches it catch before finally speaking. Not this tomb. Not while I've stood watch. But the valley remembers things guards prefer not to speak of at night. Kenneman waits, sensing there's more, and after a long moment, Pharaoh continues, his tone carrying the particular weight of something learned rather than merely heard secondhand. There was a tomb, years before my time, further along the valley. Not one I've ever seen opened, but the stories passed down among guards the way certain lessons need to be. He pauses, choosing his words with visible care. It wasn't broken into by strangers. That's the part that matters most. It was workers. Men who'd helped build it. Men who knew exactly where the weak points were, because they'd placed the stones themselves. The fire pops softly, and Kenneman finds himself leaning slightly closer, though he isn't certain whether it's for warmth or attention. That's why the necropolis divides the work the way it does. Pharaoh continues. No single crew sees the whole tome complete. No single scribe holds every record. Even the guards rotate between different tombs across a season, so no one man grows too familiar with any single doorway's exact weaknesses. He glances toward their own sealed entrance. Familiarity is dangerous. It breeds a kind of comfort that makes a man start seeing opportunity instead of duty. Seti shifts uneasily. But it still happened, somewhere. It still happened. Pharaoh agrees, without softening the truth of it. Desperation makes fools of careful men. A bad harvest. A debt that can't be paid any other way. Sometimes a man convinces himself the dead have no more use for gold than the living do, and that a small piece taken quietly will never be missed among so much else. Kenneman considers this, turning it over against everything he's absorbed about the valley these past weeks. How would anyone even know? If it was small enough. They know. Pharaoh says simply. Every object down there was recorded before the ceiling. Painted lists, sometimes carved ones, kept by scribes whose entire duty is remembering exactly what was placed and where. A missing vessel isn't just a missing vessel. It's an error in a record that was never supposed to contain errors. Eventually, someone checks. Eventually, someone notices. And then, Seti asks, though something in his tone suggests he already suspects the answer. and then it becomes a matter for people far above men like us. Pharaoh says. The kind of consequence that follows not just the man who took something, but sometimes his family, his village, anyone who might have known and said nothing. It isn't a punishment reserved only for the guilty hand. That's precisely why it's remembered as a lesson, and not simply as an old story. The weight of this settles over their small circle, and for a while none of them speak, each left alone with the particular chill of imagining consequences that extend so far beyond a single choice, a single night of weakness. Is that why you checked the seal twice? Kenneman finally asks. Once as yourself, once as a stranger. Pharaoh allows the faintest trace of a smile, among other reasons. But yes, a stranger's eyes don't excuse familiarity. They don't assume the seal is fine just because it was fine yesterday, and the day before, and every day before that. He looks toward the tomb now, its dark shape steady and unchanged against the paler stone behind it. The valley doesn't forgive assumptions, it only forgives vigilance. Sati nods slowly, some of his earlier lightness not quite returning, though the mood around the fire settles into something more thoughtful than tense. Kenneman watches the tomb entrance a while longer, understanding now, more fully than before, that the stillness he guards isn't simply the absence of danger. It is the ongoing, deliberate defeat of a danger that has, at least once, somewhere in this valley's long history, found a way through. Above them, the stars continue their unhurried procession, indifferent as ever, while three men sit a little closer to their fire than they had an hour before. The story settles into the fire's embers, and Kenneman finds his mind turning now toward the larger machinery behind it all. Not just the vigilance of individual guards, but the whole deliberate architecture built to make a tomb difficult to violate in the first place. It seems, the more he considers it, that his own watchfulness is only the final layer of something far more elaborate. The false doors. Pharaoh says, as if reading the direction of his thoughts. Has anyone mentioned those to you yet? Kenneman shakes his head, and Pharaoh settles more comfortably, clearly willing to fill the remaining hours with instruction rather than silence. Some tombs are built with more than one entrance carved into the design, he explains. Not real entrances. Passages that lead nowhere, or nearly nowhere, dug deliberately to confuse anyone who breaks through the first seal without proper knowledge. A thief in the dark, moving quickly because he knows he's already running out of safe time, doesn't have the luxury of testing every passage carefully. He follows the first opening that looks promising. Sometimes that opening leads him in circles. Sometimes it leads him toward a drop he didn't expect. That seems cruel, Sati murmurs. It's not built for cruelty. Pharaoh corrects gently. It's built for delay. Every wrong turn costs time. And time is the one thing a man who shouldn't be there can least afford. He gestures vaguely toward the cliffs surrounding them. The rubble fill works the same way. Passages aren't left open and empty after the burial. They're packed deliberately, floor to ceiling sometimes, with broken stone and debris. Digging through that by torchlight, working quietly enough not to be heard, takes far longer than most men expect, and far longer than most are willing to risk. Kenneman considers the sheer physical effort this would require a task made more difficult. He realizes, by fear itself and the certainty that discovery meant far more than simple failure. And the seals themselves, Pharaoh continues. You've seen how carefully they're inspected. That's not simply habit for its own sake. Each seal carries a specific mark, changed periodically, known only to the necropolis officials and the guards assigned to check it. A break in the plaster can sometimes be smoothed over by a clever hand, made to look untouched to an untrained eye. But the mark itself is harder to forge convincingly, especially under close inspection by someone who's studied its exact shape 100 times before. What about the location? Kenneman asks. Choosing this valley at all? That's the oldest defense of all, Pharaoh says. Older kings built their tombs as towering monuments, visible for miles, practically inviting attention. This valley exists because those tombs proved too easy a target. Hidden among identical cliffs, with no grand structure marking exactly where a king lies, a tomb becomes far harder to even locate, let alone breach. Half the guard's work, if you think about it rightly, was already done for us by whoever chose to build here in the first place. Sati leans back slightly, considering this new understanding of their surroundings. So it's not really us against thieves. It's just us as one part of a much larger wall. That's closer to the truth than most guards realize when they first arrive, Pharaoh says, something almost approving in his tone. You'll hear men talk sometimes as though a single spear and a single pair of watchful eyes stands between the Pharaoh's rest and total ruin. It's not so simple, and honestly, it's better that it isn't. No single point should ever hold that much weight alone. Layers protect better than heroes do. Kedemon turns this over, watching how the tomb entrance sits so plainly, so unremarkably, against the vast pale rock around it. Understanding now that this very plainness is itself a kind of armor, deliberate rather than accidental. Every choice, from the valley's hidden geography down to the smallest painted mark on a seal, seems woven from the same patient philosophy. That true security rarely depends on any single strong point, but on many small, careful obstacles, layered quietly enough that few who face them ever fully appreciate how deliberately each one was placed. The fire has burned low again, and Pharaoh rises to feed it. The conversation settling into a comfortable pause. Three men, wrapped now in a shared, quiet respect for the invisible architecture surrounding their small, visible wall. Sati's stomach makes a low, unmistakable sound, and he grimaces slightly, breaking the thoughtful quiet that had settled over their small circle. That fish was smaller than I remembered eating, he mutters, and Pharaoh chuckles, the sound low and genuine, a rare full release of humor in a night otherwise spent on graver matters. Third watch always feels hungrier, Pharaoh says. Something about the cold this deep into the night. Body starts asking for fuel it doesn't strictly need. He reaches toward a woven bag set carefully near the fire's edge, producing a small cloth bundle, which he unwraps to reveal a handful of dates, slightly wrinkled but still sweet, smelling even in the cool air. Kedemon accepts two when offered, chewing slowly, grateful for the simple sweetness after hours of nothing but water and dried fish. It occurs to him, not for the first time tonight, how carefully rationed everything here seems to be, not from scarcity exactly, but from a deliberate philosophy of enough rather than abundance. How much do we actually get? He asks. For a full posting, I mean. Not just tonight. Pharaoh considers this while chewing his own share. Grain allowance comes from the necropolis administration, same as any state worker. Bread, mostly, along with beer, which counts more for the water in it than the drink itself, if you understand my meaning. Dried fish when it's available. Dates, onions, sometimes garlic, though I've never much cared for it myself. Nothing rich. Nothing wasted, either. And water. Kedemon asks, glancing toward the modest jar resting near the fire, already noticeably lighter than it had been at the start of the night. That's the real concern. Pharaoh admits, his tone shifting slightly, more serious now. There's a well nearer the village, shared among the work crews and guards both, but carrying enough for a full night's posting means planning ahead carefully. Too little, and your rationing sips through hours that feel far longer than they are. Too much, and you're hauling extra weight across ground that doesn't reward carelessness with heavy jars. Sati nods along, clearly having learned this particular lesson through some memory he doesn't offer aloud. First month, I misjudged it twice. He admits instead, a note of old embarrassment coloring his voice. Nearly finished my water before midnight both times. Learned to fill an extra jar after that. even if it means an uncomfortable walk back for it. Kenneman files this away carefully, understanding that mistakes here, however small, tend to become lessons repeated forward through. However, many guards eventually hear the story. He wonders how many of the valley's quiet rules were first written not by careful planning, but by exactly this kind of hard, thirsty experience. The length of the watches themselves, he asks instead. How is that decided? It feels longer than I expected. Some hours. Depends on the season. Pharaoh explains. Summer nights are shorter, easier in some ways, harder in others, since the heat lingers so late into evening before finally breaking. Winter nights stretch longer, colder too, testing patience differently than heat does. Whatever the season, watches are divided to keep any single man from standing too long without rest, though too long still means longer than most outside this valley would consider reasonable. How many hours, roughly? Kenneman presses, genuinely curious now. Pharaoh glances up at the sky, gauging something in the position of the stars that Kenneman doesn't yet know how to read himself. We're perhaps 4 hours into full dark now. Dawn's still some hours off yet. A full night's posting, divided fairly among however many guards are present, generally means each man stands somewhere between 3 and 5 hours of direct watch, split by whatever rest the schedule allows around it. It sounds, put plainly like that, both entirely reasonable and quietly exhausting all at once, and Kenneman suspects this dual nature is precisely why the post demands such careful selection of temperament in the first place. A man who resented the hours, who counted them bitterly rather than accepting their necessity, would surely find the work unbearable long before his body ever did. The fire crackles low, and Seti passes the water jar around once more, each man taking only what he needs, no more. The small ritual of careful sharing as much a part of the night's rhythm now as the watching itself. Eat when you can, Pharaoh says finally, settling back with the particular contentment of a man whose stomach, however modestly, has been satisfied. Drink when you can. The valley doesn't care whether you're comfortable. But comfort, even small comfort, keeps a man sharp longer than discomfort ever will. Beyond the practical dangers of theft and neglect, another kind of vigilance settles over the valley once true darkness falls, one less concerned with human hands than with older, quieter fears carried by every guard who has ever stood this post. It is a fear rarely spoken aloud, though its presence shapes small habits and unspoken rituals throughout the long hours of the night. Belief in the power of the dead runs deep through this culture, woven into daily life so thoroughly that guarding a royal tomb means guarding not only physical wealth, but something far less tangible, the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond it. A pharaoh, in death, is understood to hold power that does not simply end with his final breath. His spirit is believed to persist, capable of blessing or troubling those who show him proper respect or fail to. For a guard, this belief shapes the smallest of behaviors. Loud speech near the tomb entrance is avoided instinctively, not merely out of professional discretion, but from a quieter unease about drawing unwanted attention from whatever presence might still linger behind the sealed doorway. Sudden movement is discouraged in the same spirit, a caution rooted as much in respect as in practicality. Certain hours of the night carry their own particular weight. The stretch just before dawn, when the sky begins its first faint lightening, but true daybreak remains still some distance off, is considered by many guards to be the thinnest hour, the moment when the separation between worlds feels most fragile. Experienced guards often describe an instinct to stay especially still and especially quiet during this window, less from any specific danger than from a long-held sense that the hour itself demands particular reverence. Small protective gestures accompany many guards through their postings, quiet habits carried privately rather than announced. A pinch of natron, the same substance used in the embalming process itself, is sometimes carried in a small fold of cloth, believed to offer a measure of protection against restless spirits. Certain phrases, half prayer and half old habit, are murmured under the breath before a guard's first watch of the night begins. Words passed down through generations of postings, rather than formally taught. The valley's own natural sounds feed easily into this atmosphere. The dry rustle of settling sand, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, the occasional pop and crack of cooling stone contracting after the day's heat, all of it can, in the deep isolation of a night watch, take on a weight beyond its ordinary explanation. Even guards who consider themselves practical by temperament describe moments when an ordinary sound seemed, briefly, to carry something more deliberate within it. This is not treated as foolishness by those who share the post. Rather, it is regarded as simply another layer of the job's demands, as real in its own way as the physical discipline of standing long hours or inspecting a seal correctly. A guard who dismisses these fears entirely is sometimes viewed with as much caution as one who lets them overwhelm his composure. Neither extreme, the old guidance suggests, serves a man well out here. Better to hold a measured respect for what cannot be fully explained, while still performing every practical duty with unwavering attention. Priests occasionally visit the valley to perform small rites meant to reassure the living as much as to honor the dead. Offerings left quietly near certain markers. Brief chants carried on the wind before fading back into silence. Guards are rarely required to participate directly, but many linger nearby during these visits regardless, drawing some quiet comfort from witnessing the ritual, even from a respectful distance. What emerges, across seasons and postings, is a particular kind of endurance. Not the absence of unease, but the steady willingness to stand within it anyway, night after night, trusting that discipline and respect together offer their own form of protection. The valley does not ask its guards to feel no fear. It asks only that fear never be allowed to compromise the stillness their duty requires. As the night deepens further still, that stillness holds, undisturbed by whatever quiet uncertainties pass silently through the minds of those keeping watch beneath the ancient cliffs. Deep in the stretch of night that falls hardest between one watch and the next, the desert reveals itself to be far less silent than it first appears to unfamiliar ears. What sounds at a distance or in memory like total stillness proves instead to be a layered quiet, threaded through with countless small sounds that only reveal themselves to someone standing motionless long enough to notice. A guard alone on a night watch learns quickly to sort these sounds into categories, almost without conscious effort, a private catalogue built through repetition rather than instruction. There is the sound of settling sand, dry and soft, shifting under its own slow weight as temperature changes pull grains loose from wherever the day's heat had fixed them in place. There is the sharper, occasional crack of limestone contracting after sunset, a sound sudden enough to startle even an experienced ear, though it fades as quickly as it arrives. Wind, when it comes at all in this sheltered valley, rarely announces itself as a gust. More often it arrives as a faint moving pressure, felt against skin before it's heard at all, curling around outcroppings and cliff faces in a low, almost conversational murmur that rises and falls without any predictable rhythm. On certain nights, this wind finds its way through narrow gaps in the rock formations, producing a thin, hollow tone, not unlike breath drawn slowly through pursed lips, faint enough that a guard might question, briefly, whether he imagined it entirely. Small creatures contribute their own share to the night's quiet chorus. The scrabble of a gecko crossing sun-warmed stone, the occasional soft thump of a gerbo's hind legs against packed sand, quick and startled, gone again before the sound fully registers, distant, thin, and lonely. The call of some nocturnal bird occasionally threads across the valley from somewhere beyond the ridgeline, unanswered, unrepeated, swallowed back into silence as completely as it arrived. It is these ordinary sounds, more than any dramatic disturbance, that occupy most of a guard's careful attention through the deepest hours of night. Distinguishing between the harmless and the significant becomes, over time, a kind of quiet expertise, built patiently across many uneventful nights rather than mastered in any single dramatic moment. Certain sounds demand more careful attention than others. A footstep, however faint, carries a rhythm distinct from the desert's natural movements, an evenness and intention that sand and wind and small creatures simply do not produce. A guard trained to notice this difference will pause immediately, breath held, senses extended fully toward the source, waiting for confirmation or dismissal before resuming his rounds. Most such pauses end in nothing, the sound revealing itself, after a moment's careful attention, to be nothing more than a larger creature moving through loose gravel, or the guard's own earlier footsteps somehow doubling back strangely against the cliff's natural acoustics. The valley's steep walls play curious tricks with sound sometimes, bending and redirecting noise in ways that can make a single footfall seem, for one disorienting instant, to arrive from an entirely different direction than its true source. Across an entire posting, a guard gradually builds an intimate, almost instinctive familiarity with this landscape's particular voice, learning which sounds belong and which do not, developing a sensitivity sharp enough to notice even minute deviations from the expected pattern of a quiet night. This skill, more than physical strength or bravery, forms the true foundation of effective tomb guarding, a slow, built attunement that cannot be rushed or taught quickly, only earned through many long nights of careful, patient listening. It is, in its own way, a form of intimacy with a landscape that offers little warmth or welcome to those who don't take the time to understand it properly. The valley speaks constantly, in its low, dry, patient language of settling stone and shifting sand and distant creatures moving through darkness. And a guard's truest skill lies not in silencing that voice, but in learning to listen closely enough to know, without hesitation, exactly what it means. Far above, indifferent to this quiet human vigilance, the stars continue their slow migration across a sky untouched by anything the valley below might whisper. Not every opening of a royal tome was an act of violation. Long before any question of theft or trespass, entry into these sealed chambers followed its own careful, sanctioned rhythm, understood and respected by everyone posted to guard them. Understanding this distinction matters, for it shapes much of what a guard's vigilance is actually protecting against, and what, by contrast, was always meant to happen in its proper time. Authorized entry occurred under specific, deliberate circumstances. During the final stages of burial preparation, before the last seal was ever pressed into place, priests and officials moved through the unfinished chambers repeatedly, arranging offerings, completing rites, ensuring every object rested exactly where careful planning had determined it should. This period of activity, though it involved the same doorway a guard would later spend countless nights protecting, carried none of the tension associated with later, unauthorized entry. It was measured, documented, expected. Periodic inspection, in some cases, required a controlled and carefully witnessed reopening long after initial sealing, though this was approached with a solemnity matching the original burial itself. Such visits were never undertaken lightly or without extensive preparation. Officials and priests involved would first perform their own protective rites. Small offerings and quiet words meant to ease the disturbance of a threshold otherwise left undisturbed for months or years at a time. The physical process of authorized reopening followed careful procedure. The seal itself was examined first, its mark recorded and compared against earlier documentation, ensuring the boundary being crossed matched exactly what had been left in place. Only once this verification was complete would the rubble fill behind the entrance begin to be cleared. A slow and deliberate labor undertaken by trusted workers under close supervision, never rushed regardless of how long the task required. Guards present during such occasions took on a role distinct from their usual nightly vigilance. Rather than simply watching for disturbance, they became witnesses to a sanctioned process, standing at careful distance while priests and officials completed whatever business required the tomb's temporary reopening. This might involve the addition of further offerings, adjustments made necessary by unforeseen circumstances, or simply a formal confirmation that all remained undisturbed within. A reassurance passed back through official channels to those responsible for the tomb's ongoing security. Once such business concluded, resealing followed its own careful ritual, mirroring in many ways the original ceremony. Fresh plaster was applied with the same attention given to the first sealing, the appropriate mark pressed once more into its surface, the rubble fill replaced and packed as securely as circumstances allowed. Guards resumed their nightly watch immediately after. The interruption folded seamlessly back into the valley's ongoing rhythm of vigilance, as though the brief reopening had simply been another small chapter within the tomb's much longer story of careful protection. What distinguished these sanctioned entries most clearly from any unauthorized breach was their transparency. Nothing about an official visit sought to hide itself. Torches burned openly rather than being shielded or dimmed. Voices, though respectful and measured, were not hushed to the point of secrecy. Movement through the tomb's corridors followed known paths rather than the desperate, uncertain searching that might characterize an intrusion driven by less legitimate purpose. For a guard, witnessing such an occasion, however rare across an entire posting, offered a valuable clarity. It confirmed, in a way that mere instruction never fully could, exactly what proper entry looked and sounded like, sharpening by contrast an instinct for recognizing anything that might depart from that expected pattern. A guard who had once stood witness to an authorized reopening carried forward a more precise understanding of the threshold he protected, no longer relying solely on description or rumor, but on direct, careful memory. Such occasions, rare as they were within any single guard's years of service, became quietly significant markers within the valley's long, patient history, each one a brief, sanctioned exception within an otherwise unbroken discipline of sealed and watchful stillness, carried out with the same reverence that had shaped every other aspect of the tomb's original construction and ongoing protection. Long before any guard ever took up his post beside a sealed doorway, another kind of labor shaped this valley entirely, one whose presence still lingers faintly in the very stone the guards now protect. The tombs did not simply appear, hollowed by time or chance. They were carved, chamber by careful chamber, by a community of skilled workers whose lives, though rarely remembered by name, remain etched quietly into every corridor and painted wall. This community lived in the settlement nearby, the same village where guards and their families now make their homes between rotations. Generations of workers passed their skills down within it, fathers teaching sons the particular discipline required to cut clean, level passages through solid limestone, using little more than copper chisels, wooden mullets, and an intimate, practiced understanding of stone's natural grain. Work within the tomb proceeded in careful stages, each requiring its own specialized skill. Quarrymen led the initial excavation, cutting deep into the cliff face along lines marked beforehand by more senior craftsmen who understood how to judge a tomb's eventual shape long before its full extent became visible. Behind them followed workers responsible for smoothing rough, cut walls into surfaces fine enough to receive plaster and paint, a labor requiring patience as much as strength, each stroke of a polishing stone bringing the rock closer to a finish worthy of eternity. Painters and sculptors completed the final transformation, working by the light of simple oil lamps deep within passages that never saw natural daylight once excavation moved beyond the entrance corridor. Mirrors, carefully angled, sometimes redirected sunlight further into these depths, extending the working day and allowing craftsmen to judge color and detail with something closer to true daylight than lamp flame alone could offer. Even so, much of this delicate work was completed under conditions demanding extraordinary skill, artists rendering intricate detail from memory, and practiced hand as much as from clear sight. The physical toll of this labor was considerable, and workers' lives, though respected within their community, were far from easy. Long hours in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces left many with lasting effects on health. Breathing difficulties and joint pain common among those who spent decades working stone in such conditions. Yet alongside this hardship existed genuine pride, a sense of purpose distinct from ordinary labor, rooted in the understanding that their work would outlast not only their own lives, but likely the memory of their names as well. Documentation from the period, however incomplete, reveals glimpses of this workforce's daily concerns, remarkably human despite the extraordinary nature of their task. Records describe disputes over rations, complaints about tool quality, occasional work stoppages when conditions grew intolerable enough to warrant collective protest. Far from the silent, reverent labor one might imagine surrounding such sacred work, the reality involved all the ordinary friction of any workforce, tempered only slightly by the unusual weight of what they were building. Payment came primarily through state-provided rations, distributed regularly though not always reliably, a system that occasionally strained under administrative difficulties beyond any individual worker's control. Despite this, the community persisted across generations, its skills and knowledge passed forward carefully, ensuring that each new tomb benefited from centuries of accumulated understanding about how best to work this particular stone, in this particular valley, for this particular sacred purpose. Guards, standing their nightly watch, walk paths first cleared by these same hands, protect seals pressed into plaster mixed and applied by workers whose individual names have mostly faded from memory, though their collective skill remains permanently visible in every carefully finished surface. There exists, in this quiet connection, a kind of continuity easily overlooked amid the more dramatic concerns of theft and protection. A recognition that guarding these tombs means, in some small way, honoring not only the Pharaoh sealed within, but also the countless ordinary hands that made his eternal resting place possible in the first place. The valley holds both memories equally within its stone, the labor of creation and the labor of protection woven together across generations into something larger than either effort alone could have accomplished. As the deepest hours of night settle further into their slow, unbroken rhythm, a different kind of challenge asserts itself, one less dramatic than fear of theft or superstition, yet in some ways more constant and more difficult to guard against. Exhaustion, in this posting, becomes a persistent companion, arriving not as a single overwhelming wave, but as a gradual erosion, hour by hour, of the sharpness a guard depends upon. The nature of the work itself invites this particular difficulty. Unlike labor that occupies the body fully, tomb guarding demands sustained attention toward an environment that, by design and by necessity, offers almost nothing to actively engage with. The tomb entrance remains unchanged. The valley's shapes, once memorized, cease to offer fresh visual interest. What began, in earlier hours, as heightened awareness gradually softens into something harder to sustain, a stillness that risks tipping, without constant discipline, into genuine drowsiness. Guards develop, across their postings, a range of quiet techniques to manage this particular hazard. Deliberate changes in posture, shifting weight periodically, standing rather than sitting during the hours when alertness proves hardest to maintain, all serve as small physical anchors against the pull of fatigue. Some guards find that slow, deliberate walking, even along paths already thoroughly familiar, helps maintain a wakefulness that stillness alone cannot preserve. Others rely on structured routines of inspection, breaking long stretches of otherwise undifferentiated time into smaller, purposeful segments, each with its own brief sense of completion. Boredom, distinct from exhaustion though closely related to it, presents its own particular burden. A mind left too long without engagement tends to wander, sometimes productively, often less so, drifting toward worry, toward memory, toward imagined scenarios that serve no useful purpose beyond filling otherwise empty hours. Experienced guards learn to recognize this drift early, redirecting attention deliberately back toward the immediate environment before idle thought can fully take hold and dull the edge of necessary vigilance. Isolation compounds both challenges considerably. Even when guards share a posting in pairs or small groups, long stretches of the night are often spent in individual silence, each man occupying his own private stretch of watchfulness, even while technically in company. This solitude, though necessary to the work's demands, carries its own weight across the length of an entire posting, a quiet loneliness that experienced guards learn to accept rather than resist, understanding it as simply another dimension of the role they've accepted. Seasoned guards often describe a particular skill developed only through considerable time in this posting, an ability to remain present without becoming restless, to occupy long empty hours without either succumbing to drowsiness or being worn down by tedium. This skill resembles, in some ways, a kind of quiet endurance more commonly associated with other demanding forms of labor, though rarely discussed with the same recognition given to more visibly strenuous work. The physical toll accumulates gradually across a full season of postings. Sleep patterns, disrupted by the irregular rhythm of shifted watches, rarely settle into anything resembling the deep, restorative rest available to those with more conventional schedules. Guards often describe a persistent low-grade tiredness that shadows them even during daylight hours meant for recovery, a fatigue that becomes, over time, simply another familiar condition of the work rather than a temporary discomfort to be resolved. Despite these considerable challenges, guards who remain in this posting across multiple seasons often describe a gradual adaptation, not an elimination of exhaustion or boredom entirely, but a steadier relationship with both. The mind and body, given sufficient time, learn to conserve energy differently, to find small satisfactions within the work's inherent repetition, to treat the long stretches of solitary watching less as burden and more as simply the shape their working life has taken. This adaptation, hard-won and rarely discussed openly among guards themselves, forms perhaps the truest measure of whether a man belongs to this particular kind of service. Strength and courage, valued as they are, matter less in the end than this quieter, less celebrated capacity to endure long emptiness without breaking beneath its weight, night after night, season after season, for as long as the posting requires. A subtle shift begins to move through the valley, so gradual it might pass unnoticed by anyone less attuned to this landscape's particular rhythms. The absolute black of deep night starts, almost imperceptibly, to soften at its edges, the stars nearest the eastern horizon beginning to lose some fraction of their earlier brilliance, though true dawn remains still some distance away. This transitional stretch carries its own distinct character, different from the hours that preceded it. The coldest point of the entire night typically arrives here, in these final hours before sunrise, when accumulated darkness has drawn every trace of the previous day's warmth fully from stone and sand alike. A guard's discipline, already tested by hours of sustained watchfulness, faces its sharpest challenge in this stretch, body and mind both straining against a fatigue compounded now by genuine physical cold. Yet alongside this difficulty comes a quieter form of anticipation, an awareness that the long night's vigil approaches its natural completion. Seasoned guards describe learning to recognize small, specific signs of this approaching transition, subtle enough that only extended familiarity with the valley reveals them clearly. A faint change in the quality of silence itself, as certain nocturnal sounds begin to fade while others, associated with earliest morning, have not yet begun. A barely perceptible shift in air movement, as the valley's trapped nighttime stillness begins, ever so slightly, to loosen. The practical duties of a guard's final watch differ subtly from earlier hours. A more thorough inspection often takes place during this stretch, examining the tomb's seal and surrounding ground with particular care, understanding that whatever might have gone undetected through the night's longest, darkest hours would need discovering now, before the change of guard and the return to ordinary daylight activity. This final inspection carries a weight distinct from earlier, routine checks, a sense of closing out one complete cycle of protection before handing responsibility forward to whatever arrangement the coming day requires. Physical discomfort reaches its peak during this stretch as well. Limbs stiffened by hours of sustained stillness or careful, deliberate walking now carry a deeper ache, made sharper by the night's accumulated cold. Hunger, held at bay through careful rationing of the night's modest provisions, often reasserts itself keenly during these final hours, the body's demands growing harder to ignore as the promise of proper morning food draws gradually nearer. Despite these mounting discomforts, something steadying accompanies this final stretch as well, a sense of accumulated accomplishment quietly settling over a guard who has maintained careful vigilance through an entire night's demands. The tomb remains sealed, undisturbed, exactly as it was left the previous evening. Whatever fears, superstitions, or physical hardships shaped the hours behind him, they have been met and endured without failure, a private satisfaction rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt nonetheless. The valley itself seems to hold its breath differently during this final stretch, the profound stillness of deep night giving way gradually to something more expectant, as though the landscape itself senses the approaching return of light and warmth. Small stirrings begin to suggest themselves at the very edges of perception. The earliest, faintest suggestion of movement among whatever creatures make their home in the surrounding rock, sensed more than truly seen or heard. A guard nearing the end of his posting learns to draw a particular kind of quiet strength from this stretch of night, understanding it not merely as the hardest remaining obstacle before rest, but as confirmation of the discipline that has carried him successfully through everything the darkness demanded. The coldest hour, faced squarely and endured without faltering, becomes its own quiet testament to the steadiness this work requires and, gradually, instills. Above the valley, the eastern sky continues its slow, patient transformation, stars fading one by one into a deepening blue that promises, without yet delivering, the return of full daylight. The first true light of dawn arrives not as a sudden event, but as a gradual dissolving. Darkness thinning by degrees, until the cliffs surrounding the valley reveal themselves once more in soft, uncertain outline, gold and rose gathering slowly along their highest edges before spreading downward into the shadowed depths below. The tomb entrance, invisible for hours except as a darker patch against darker stone, now emerges clearly again, its plastered seal catching the day's first honest light, unbroken, exactly as it was left the previous evening. With this returning light comes the quiet, practiced business of concluding a night's watch. A final walk around the tomb's perimeter confirms what careful listening and long vigilance have already suggested through the night's final hours, that nothing has disturbed the ground, the seal, the fragile boundary between what lies within and the world, now waking beyond it. This last inspection carries a particular thoroughness, a guard's closing account rendered not in words alone, but in careful, physical confirmation. Relief arrives gradually rather than all at once. Guards completing their rotation, exchanging brief acknowledgement with those arriving fresh to take up the day's lighter duties. The tomb's protection passing seamlessly from one set of watchful eyes to another without any true gap in its careful continuity. Those finishing their long night's posting gather their few belongings. The small lamp now unnecessary in the strengthening light. The spear that has rested across tired knees through so many hours, both carried now with the particular ease of duty properly completed. The walk back toward the village follows the same narrow path first climbed weeks or months earlier, though it feels different now, familiar in a way that first approach never was. Morning light reveals details easily missed in the urgency of arrival or the exhaustion of departure on previous days. The particular color of certain rock formations, a scattering of small desert plants clinging improbably to shallow soil in protected crevices, the way the valley's steep walls, so imposing and strange in darkness, soften considerably under full daylight into something almost gentle. Behind, the tomb settles into its daylight rhythm, distinct from the watchful tension of night. Fewer guards remain posted during these hours, the greater visibility of daytime offering its own natural protection that darkness cannot provide. Workers move through nearby areas on their own daily business, their presence a reminder of the valley's larger purpose, beyond the singular focus of nighttime vigilance, life and labor continuing alongside the solemn stillness of royal rest. For a guard completing his posting, this transition back toward ordinary daylight life carries its own particular weight, the accumulated discipline of an entire night's watchfulness gradually loosening into the more relaxed rhythms of daytime rest and recovery. Sleep, when it finally comes in the relative comfort of a proper bed, rather than a narrow shelter's woven mat, arrives deep and complete. The body finally permitted the fuller rest that fragmented nighttime dozing could never quite provide. Yet something of the valley's particular stillness lingers, even in this departure, carried forward into ordinary daylight hours in ways not always fully recognized by the guards themselves. A heightened awareness of small sounds, a settled patience with long stretches of uneventful time, a quiet, private understanding of what genuine vigilance requires, earned through direct experience rather than mere instruction, and carried forward into whatever tasks and seasons still lie ahead. The tomb itself remains, as it has remained for however many years already, and will remain for however many years still to come, sealed and silent beneath the strengthening sun, holding within its careful darkness whatever remains of a king's final journey, protected now as thoroughly as careful human hands and patient vigilance can manage. Tonight, when darkness returns once more to settle over these ancient cliffs, another watch will begin. Another set of careful eyes will take up the same quiet duty, continuing a discipline stretching back further than any single guard's memory and reaching forward, presumably toward a future none of them will ever fully see. For now, though, morning belongs to rest, and to the valley's brief daily pause between one careful vigil and the next.